Should I go and shut the door?
I don't know. Just start.
Yeah, it's done.
Okay, cool.
I'm just going to smoke a cigarette.
Cool. Right. Today's talk, this is a bit where your blood drains from your face. It's like the prospect of standing up in front of people. So today's to talk about DevOps for Joomla. Introduction thing. So I'm Andy. Hi. And so I'm a web developer with 20 years experience. I've been using Joomla for about 10 years, and the last few years I'm mainly doing APIs and app-related systems. Yeah, it's just Andy Gaskell on Twitter. So yeah, that's a bit at the beginning when you say like who you are and where you're from. So anyway, just a pop quiz. Can anyone recognise this sun-drenched metropolis?
So cruel message.
Yeah, hey, cool. So that bit where you're like, so yeah, I lived in Croydon for in South London for 18 years, and then Edinburgh for 6 years, and Australia for a couple of years, and hey, what about anyone? Anyway, yeah, Glasgow for 10 years, and I've been living in Aberdeen for like the last 8 years. How old are the children? 8 years. Yeah, so we stayed out here next to the hospital where my wife works. Yeah, it's got a beach and boats and oil rigs and shit. So yeah, and if you even those places out, averaging out by time, the mean location is about 100 miles off Whitby. So I think technically I'm from here.
You should get a boat then.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, it's good for fishing, you know. So yeah, so as an introduction. So this talk's really based on experience from the last couple of years developing, the company I work for, we develop apps for schools, and there's lots of apps for lots of schools. So everything gets it's a scale out as well as scale up. So, and we use Joomla as the back end for the apps, which allows the schools to modify the content on their app. And there's an API. And yeah, so there's like hundreds of Joomla instances, each one controlling a separate mobile phone application. So this is really where this has come from in terms of the talk, is experiences of massively scaling out Joomla. Massively? Well, quite largely scaling out Joomla. And it's just a startup, so there's only a small team. So we kind of end up having to do everything, like you do. Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of stuff to cover because DevOps is obviously a huge area. So we're going to do DevOps. We're going to do a little bit about continuous integration and continuous deployment, or CD and CI. So continuous integration is really just rolling out changes quickly, I guess, or continuously. And continuous deployment would be really about deploying them quickly as well. It's kind of agile things, I suppose. Not really use the word agile, to be honest. So there's ideas in theory and there's practical examples. Yeah. So this is, when people talk about DevOps, it's like development on one side and operations on the other side. In a large team, you would have an operations team and you'd have a development team, and you might have a QA team and this sort of thing, architectural team, and but in practice, more people work in small teams, or even just a couple of people, 1 or 2 people, and so a lot of things. This used to be hard, and now this is less hard in practice. And a lot of times the ops side of things traditionally has been done by a hosting company, perhaps, so it's not really something we've had to think about. But and development is normal things like writing code, testing code, and stuff. Yeah, and so this would be the cycle of continuous integration, and basically doing this every day. Yeah. Yeah, and the main principle is the idea of the more you automate within the cycle, the quicker you can do stuff. whether it's breaking things quickly or fixing things quickly or improving things quickly. Yeah, usually breaking things quickly too. So all the notes and codes based on running Joomla on normal Linux sort of stack. There's examples in GitHub, and just ask any questions anytime. Just butt in, don't be shy. Oh, and there's a big disclaimer. There's loads and loads of stuff in DevOps, so this is a small tip of the iceberg, really. But hopefully, useful scattergun of information and practical examples. So, yeah. So automation is really one of the main keys for DevOps. Because basically, if you do something more than twice, you should just automate it, because you're probably going to have to do it a third time and a fourth time, and it's really boring doing the same thing over and over again. And it's much more fun writing script to do it for you, and then not doing it again. So scripting. Does anyone have any? Who likes doing scripting in Bash? Cool. Who likes doing scripting in PHP? Okay, cool. I'm only asking because I slightly adjust the talk. Who likes doing scripting in Node? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. I'm not a big JavaScript fan, so I'm probably more inclined to the other two. But yeah. But that's good to get a feeling for. So yeah, there's some things like DevOps, kind of handy things to know to be able to do. Like in a general running server sense. So whether it's finding that finding big log files that are more than I'm running out of disk space. What are the big things? Or finding a bit of text in a bunch of PHP files, or finding a bit of text in PHP or any files. It's just I don't know. Google it, find it on Stack Overflow, copy and paste it, and then do the same again next time. So this is kind of all on the assumption you've got SSH access to your server, I suppose. But yeah. So yes, but within automation itself, you've got several options. You can script things, in PHP or Bash or JavaScript, or you can use a task runner like Grunt or Gulp, or you can use like a CI, continuous integration, continuous deployment system. Sometimes that's a good option if you've got a larger setup. Or headless browsers is like a Casper.js or CodeSet.js. That can be really handy for some sorts of automation that's easy, where you're just replicating what you would do yourself in the browser. So yeah, we'll get started. So yes, it's a good one for last week because of the updates and stuff. So this is quite a new thing, using the Joomla command line interface. I only recently started using this, to be honest, but it's really nice. So in the Joomla projects Git repository, there's an example. I think there's definitely an example of updating core, and there's a couple of other examples there as well. So it's really nice in the sense it's you just use the PHP and then you just run it on PHP on the command line, and I guess it works well for us because it's really built for what we're doing. But Brian touched on the idea of running automated updates, and in practice you could use this CLI update Joomla core script, and you could just set it in the cron to run every week or every night. That might be a bit keen, but yeah. And then from that point you'd know that your site's always going to be up to date with Joomla. And equally, there's for updating extensions too, and it's all very familiar. Really. So you just basically put the CLI PHP file on your server and just PHP and then the name of the file. Works really well, and it's really quick. I used to always do this in the headless browser, but it's much quicker doing with the Joomla CLI. I think Michael Babka wrote most of that.
So what about your server configuration? Are you running it local, or are you running somewhere in the cloud or?
It's a good. There's a bit about
Okay.
that
Yeah.
later on, but it's a good thing to mention, because one of the reasons why DevOps is easier in the way than it used to be is because of the prevalence of cloud servers and the simplicity of automation with newer cloud technologies. Yeah, but yeah, that's probably a little bit later. But ask me again if I don't really answer that properly. Yeah, so another option, I'm kind of going through quite quickly, I guess, but that's because there's quite a lot to cover. But if anything doesn't make sense, just give us a shout or button and say stop, rewind. Right. So yeah, one thing. So for automating updates, it can be really handy to it's just updating things is a constant. So whether it's updating based on your own development or but we'll look at updating based on your own development at the moment, just in this section. So yeah, so many people use Git hook scripts. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. And that's good. So we're going to talk about using Git hook scripts just now. So Git with Git hook scripts basically allows you to trigger scripts on various Git activities, you'd say, or Git commands. So it works really nicely, and you just set up locally, sort of thing. And you can. The nice thing about it is you can do piecemeal automation as you go, and it's not like a monolithic task. Yeah. If you go into your Git working copy, you'll find there's a .git folder in there, and inside the .git folder there's a folder called hooks, and when your local working copy is initiated, the hooks directory includes some example scripts which you can use as a basis for creating and developing more Git hooks. So basically the way Git hooks works is there's more Git commands that you can use as hooks, but the main ones are things like pre-commit and post-commit. So basically when you type git commit -m my changes, when that command runs, if you do a pre-commit, if you put a script in the pre-commit directory, rewind a little bit. The scripts basically work based on names. So when you commit, Git will execute the script called pre-commit before it commits the changes, and it'll execute the script called post-commit after it's committed the changes. So some things like the post-commit you could use for uploading files or running automated tests. It works really nicely for that sort of thing. So we'll have a few examples. You can also run your Git hooks on the server, but that's a little harder to set up. Oh, the nice thing is you can have different Git hooks for, say, for example, if you had a development branch and as opposed to your master, you could have execute tests in your development on post commit, but not on your master sort of thing. So in a way, you're automating the testing process of migrating code through your repositories. Yeah. So this is a really basic example. It doesn't really do anything particularly useful, but it's good to start with something to make sure you've got it all working. So this is in your Git repository, in your Git directory, .git directory. You can see there's a hooks directory, and this file is called pre-commit. So this will run before Git commits as well. So it's not very exciting really. All it does is it just appends the date onto the end of the README file and a list of all the files which are changed. yeah, so basically, every time, you know, you can end up with like something sort of like a change log at the bottom of your README. You know, you can see, so it's outputting, it's echoing this to the README, echoing the status to the README, and it's just echoing a space that make a bit tiny. Minor gotcha. You've got to make sure your Git scripts are executable, but that's given. Yeah, so I mean, that's a good starting point. Although it doesn't really do anything particularly useful. But yeah, so every time you commit, it'll. Oh.
Yeah, so this file is in our local.
Yeah, so the hook script will always execute in the root level of your the same directory where the .git folder is. So you know, so this is the assumption that like GitHub style, you've got a README in the root of your Git repository. So yeah, although the file is sitting in the subdirect, you know, 2 subdirectories down, the current working directory is always the top level. But yeah, it's good question. So moving on to a related topic, another useful automation tool is Git FTP, which is more joined up in a minute. So Git FTP is an extension of the Git client, and if you haven't got it on your system already, you can install it via brew or apt-get install Git FTP. Basically it allows you to FTP up, you know, well, your Git client knows what's changed, so it can, so in a sense, because Git FTP is, you know, part of your Git client, it can just upload what's changed. So it's a really nice, it can run it really nicely. So there's in the same, keeps the configurations in your normal Git config file, and on the server side it puts a log file on the server so that when Git FTP connects to the server, it knows the status of the server. So, it will work, you know, it's not, the only thing that's dependent on the server side is FTP, you know, having FTP access. So even on the most basic hosting, you can use this.
Does it work with SFTP?
It does, although there's a minor. I noticed in some Linux distributions, it it supports all the FTP protocols, but I have hit a snag in the last version of Ubuntu because it's dependent on curl.
Okay.
But where curl didn't support FTP,
Okay.
it would support FTPS and SCP and, you know, a bunch of other protocols. But yeah, that's tripped me out a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But you can if you type curl hyphen help, I think it gives you a list of all the supported protocols that are supported by your local version of curl. Yeah, that's it. Been a bit awkward sometimes. Yeah, so it's really easy to set up. Basically, what you would do is you run these run a bunch of configuration git config commands. So you're at git config, you put in your FTP URL and your FTP username and your FTP password. And a sync route, so that would be like your local path, you know, because you might not want to upload from the top level of your Git working copy, I suppose, you know, and your remote route, that's the remote path relative to the base. And so you know, run those 5 commands, and you only do that once, and then it's set up. And then use Git FTP init, and that. Well, there's 2 different routes. If you've already got everything uploaded, then you don't need to do Git FTP because that basically uploads everything. But so if you haven't uploaded your files already, you can use Git FTP init. But if you've already uploaded your files, which is usually the case, you can just use Git FTP catch-up, and that basically connects to the server and finds out what's on the server and compares that locally, and then starts the synchronization, or sets the synchronization status. And then from that point onwards, you just use Git FTP push, and that will just push all the changes in your local working copy to the server via FTP. So these are all one-time only set of things, and the last one is what you probably end up using all the time. So it's really nice because you can just use it as part of your commit workflow. And looping background again, this can work really nicely with using a git FTP with a git hook script. So, say for example you were to use this in a post-commit script. So this, this is a similar sort of format, but yeah, the file will be called post-commit. So that'll execute after your changes have been pushed to the Git repository. And basically you end up with a git hook script which just basically does this git FTP push, and then every time you commit, your files will be up. You'll update the server at the same time. So rather than doing two things, you're only doing one, which is half as many boring, menial, repetitive tasks, I guess. Yeah. Has anyone got any questions or queries about that?
So work on different branches. So can you target a certain branch, say the master branch, so that's the one that I want to push, not any?
Yeah, totally. So you would, if you were going to do it that way, which is like a sensible and normal way to do, you'd end up having a working copy of both branches, and you'd have different hook scripts in each working copy. It can work really nicely just to have the git hook scripts calling other scripts, because that means because the git hook scripts sit in a subdirectory of the .git folder, you can't really version control them yourself easily, because they're with your working copy. But say for example in the top level of your repository, you could create a directory called automation, and have that all version controlled nicely with all the rest of your files. And in here you could just have just call the automation scripts from the git hook script. So, and this works really nicely, especially if you want to do your scripting in PHP. You just end up with this having like a one-line, or then you can have an executable, a PHP executable here. And in practice that would go and execute your, you'd end up with like an update server script and a test system script, and you could just call them that way. That's kind of a nicer way to work. And that way it's kind of nicer because you'd end up in your master branch, you'd have a different set of scripts as opposed to or you could have the same set of scripts, but the hooks in one call are different scripts as opposed to the hooks in the other. You could even do that dynamically, so that in your script, when it executes, it checks which branch it's running on, and then runs a different bunch of logic based on that. So if it's in the master, it just does the update, and if it's not in the master, like your development might be, is most likely to be, then it just it runs automated testing and then does the update, or does the update and then automated testing. Yeah. So it can work really nicely. Yeah. The only slight problem is, with a git FTP, you can only really point git FTP at one server, which, if you're wanting to push your updates to multiple servers. But that's, there's other solutions for that too. Yeah. So we're going to touch on automated deployment at the moment, as opposed to just piecemeal updates, like deploying whole sites. And one of the best, there's a lot of different options for this, but my favourite one, to be honest, is Akeeba UNiTE. I meant to ask Nick how you the best way to pronounce that, to be honest, in Krakow, but I forgot. Yeah, there's other ways, like automating deployment with Docker and Jenkins and Travis and Vagrant, and also with symlinking too, it can work nicely. Yeah, so how many people have used Akeeba UNiTE in UNiTE? Okay, cool. So that's good. So Akeeba UNiTE is, or UNiTE, is basically an extraction utility for JPA files. How many people use Akeeba Backup? Oh, that's kind of everyone. Yeah, that's cool. So basically, Akeeba UNiTE allows for automation of extracting Akeeba Backup files to your server. So It works really nicely. I can't remember whether it's part of the free. I think it might be part of the subscription part of Akeeba, the Akeeba suite. But it's just a sort of standalone script in a sense. So what it does is it's based on XML configuration files to basically tell it what to do, which is fine because it's easy enough to read XML. You're not getting to that XML YAML, which one's better, sort of thing. It's just a file, really. But it uses the principle of an inbox. So basically, you put a bunch of XML files, one per site or JPA file, in a directory called inbox, and then you just run it on a command line, PHP UNiTE subdirectory UNiTE PHP. And this is really nice. Like, say for example, if you want to move 20 sites from one server to another, you just got 20 JPA files. You just create an XML file for each one, or duplicate and modify an XML file for each one, and then just kick it, run the script, and it will go and extract each one of those JPA files one at a time. So the XML configuration files, they kind of look like this. It's kind of, when you're reading it, you just tell it the name of the JPA file, name of your log file, name of your site, some general settings that are in your Joomla configuration.php. And there's other bits and bobs, like it needs to know about your database, database configuration that's it's targeting, and this site directory as well. So if you had 10 sites, you'd end up creating an XML file for each one, and they're all going to be pretty much the same. The only thing you're probably going to change is the database stuff and the site name and directory stuff. So you'd end up with like site1.xml, site2.xml, and you'd end up with site 1 in here, site 2 in the next one, and so forth. Site1.jpa here and site. It works, works really nicely. So we use this for deploying a couple of dozen Joomla instances every month, I guess. The process is you basically have your JPA files and you extract them. So what we tend to use is we have a system where different schools have different different base configurations. So we end up having a JPA file. There's a primary school JPA file and a secondary school JPA file. And when the sales team are provisioning the apps and Joomla instances, they choose which of these categories the site clicks in. And then basically it chooses the appropriate JPA file, which is in a sense just like a vanilla seed for the site. So we've written a script to automate this, where you can call the script and it'll instantiate. Give it 3 parameters, and it'll create a Joomla instance based on the JPA file. You include all the examples and stuff in a GitHub repository. So you can, it's kind of easy to. This is probably more useful if you're deploying many Joomla sites, I suppose. Has anyone got any queries about Akeeba bits before I move on? Cool. So I'm just going to really briefly touch on Jenkins and Travis. I did a variation on this talk in Krakow. So we did more, more developer-centric. I guess it was more developer-centric content. So in terms of deployment, there are lots of options in this whole area, like Jenkins and Travis, and in a sense, you can do a lot of the same things with Jenkins and Travis. You tend to use Jenkins and Travis for driving configuration of your automation tasks. you can do a lot of this using Git hooks in practice. So we'll just yeah, there's a whole lot more we could talk about without really too much. For the sake of time, and then yeah, but another option for quick deployment is Docker, and I don't know how many people use Docker.
Not in Joomla.
Oh, that's cool. But there's some really good Docker containers for Joomla, and so I'm not quite sold on Docker for deployment at the moment, to be honest. But it's great for testing and development. So in a sense, it allows you to spin up a sort of minimal virtual machine, which is conceptually it's quite hard to get, because in a sense the virtual machine is disposable, and the assumption is you wouldn't store any permanent information on the machine, on the virtual machine, or the Docker instance. Yeah, so once you've installed Docker, you basically start a Docker instance with one command, and that will basically start a Linux virtual machine container on your server. It can be really useful for testing. So, for example, there's a Joomla Docker instances for all the different PHP versions. If you wanted to quickly test an extension on like 6 different versions of PHP, probably using Docker is the simplest way to go. Yeah. So your files in practice don't live in Docker; they still live in your in the host file system. So you can have one file set and then spin up a container that references it. And then GitLab. Yeah.
Yeah. Do any of the hosting companies provide support for that?
Yeah, more now than used to, but yeah, still kind of feel it's like more of a development tool than I think more of the hosting companies. I think because Docker is still quite new, quite a lot of the hosting companies started their own like containerized offerings before Docker was really so mainstream. So in a sense, things like Bitnami is very much a similar thing, but doesn't use Docker. So, yeah. So there's lots of Docker containers available online, both on Joomla's GitHub, Joomla Project's GitHub account, and so you can try different ones. So, and it's quite easy to modify a Docker container as well. It's just a YAML file with all the settings. And if you want to create your own containers, you can upload them to Docker Hub, which can be useful too. So, briefly touch on Vagrant. So Vagrant is in a sense a precursor to Docker, and it's a less lightweight virtual machine container. It offers a lot of the same benefits as Docker, but it's more typically used with a persistent file system within the virtual machine. There's lots of other ways to do this. You could do it with like VirtualBox and this sort of thing. I mean, but the real benefit, particularly with Docker, is if you spin up 10 virtual machines on your using VirtualBox, for example, it's going to be like each one's going to be 2 gigabytes each. But if you did it with Docker, they're only going to be as big as the files you run in it. So one thing for Vagrant that's really useful is Joomla Tools on their Joomla Tools GitHub repository offer a great selection of Vagrant instances that you can download and use. For different, they also offer different PHP versions. And there's a few really nice ones which, if you want to spin up a development virtual machine, there's quite a few nice ones which have like all the development packages you probably typically use, like PHP and XDebug and web grinding and stuff. So, you know, if it can be a lot easier to, you know, rather than it's more, you know, if you're doing lots of different projects, it can be really useful because you don't, you know, you don't have to like version, you know, there's not an issue with your own, you know, using your own computer as a platform. You know, it's easier to test multiple platforms that way. You know. Whether or not you just want to test your site in Nginx, for example, rather than Apache to see if it works before deploying it. It's the sort of thing you could just download an Nginx vagrant container or Docker container. There's other thing, and then just test it that, you know, if you just want to give it a quick try. There's other ones as well, like Kubernetes as well, which is a Google project. They offer the similar thing. Yeah, so if you're so Vagrant still uses VirtualBox, but it is a thinner virtualization level. So yeah, you just initialize your Vagrant box and in a sense switch it on, and then you can connect it via SSH. And you know, this is based on the Joomla tools Vagrant instance. So it's really straightforward, you know, in terms of creating a platform to work on.
What does site create actually do? Populates the.
Yeah. So basically, within the Joomla tools Vagrant container, they've added a bunch of tools that run within the container. So for a lot of common like Joomla related tasks. So basically, it will go and create a Joomla instance, like a vanilla. You know, download it, create the MySQL, create the MySQL database. It just automates it. Yeah, it's just one example. Really. Yeah. So this command is running on the container itself, and this command is basically SSHing onto the operating system of the container. Yeah. I think generally, I think at the moment I kind of prefer Docker to Vagrant just because it's a bit lighter, and I don't really like VirtualBox is kind of fiddly. Yeah. Just conscious of time. I'm probably get it done with a bit more editing. But yeah, so another option for deployment, if you want to deploy multiple instances of Joomla that are similar or identical, or very, you know, is to use symbolic links. We've been experimenting with this lately. So the idea is you create a directory structure like this with a parent, you know, with perhaps a directory called parents, which would have the original with Joomla files, and you'd have a directory structure, a directory called children with Joomla instances that did not contain the files, but instead contained symbolic links from Tom to, say, for example, prod. This way, it can be nice. It can work nicely. So you can have like an alpha file set that you're delivering in a beta file set and a production file set, and then you can choose, you know, which sites are derived from which file set. Sort of things. It can make updates a little bit harder because the Joomla instances that are actually running don't really contain any files, so you end up having to update the parents rather than the children. That's not such a big problem. Yeah, so we have this example script here for creating symbolic link children. Yeah, so each children, but it sort of explains the process really. So this script would go and create a child based on a parent. So you can see there's so each child has a database, a MySQL database itself. So you can see this bit here is creating a MySQL database based on what's passed into the script. I think it's creating a username, it's creating a MySQL user, and then it's creating a database for that user. And here you can see it's dumping the database from a parent and then subsequently loading it into the child's database that we just created. Yeah. And you can see we're working through the script. so there's a bunch of directories that are required. Obviously, things like the images directory and the temp directory in the cache. So these directories are created, and the configuration file. So each child would have its own configuration file, which would point to the database for that child. And see some files are needed. So, for example, robots index. So you can see here these are copied from the parent, and the source parent is the child directory. And then basically it creates a bunch of symbolic links. So these are soft links. So it's linking. It's creating a directory. It's creating a symbolic link to the directory of the parent that child's associated with. Yeah. So in this use case, each Joomla instance is so if you had 10 Joomla sites and you had 10 full Joomla installs, you'd end up with 40,000 files. Nearly all of which would be duplicated because they're all the same Joomla. But using this instance, you'd end up with only 4,000 files. I don't know how many files are in Joomla at the moment, but like that. So it's really good for deduplicating your set. Yeah, it's an esoteric approach perhaps, but has anyone got any questions now? So once you've got this set up with parents and children, then you can switch a child from referencing one parent to another sort of thing. So there's another script here. All these are in the examples directory on GitHub. So basically this script would you could have a Joomla instance or a symbolically linked Joomla instance that was pointing to a beta file set, and then you want to switch it to an alpha file set. You would just run this script, passing in the parameter, the parent parameter and the child parameter. And that way, it's basically just going to update all the symbolic links to point to the different parents. That makes sense. So in some ways, it's really nice for updating live sites that are running constant live, because if you were going to update a live site by copying or uploading files, there's obviously a lag while the files are all being uploaded and updated. But because this isn't actually moving any files at all, it's just modifying symbolic links. It runs in 2 seconds or thereabouts. Yeah. So it would allow you to really quickly switch the site from being in beta to a live. Or that sort of thing. Let's get the setup up front. So, which is the time? Another great thing for automation. Has anyone got any questions about the symbolic link directories and Joomla instances? Okay. Come and get me afterwards if you. Another great automation option is headless browsers, which I'm going to talk about really quickly. So headless browsers have been around for a long time, and mostly people are probably most familiar with Selenium, but more recently there's probably better options that are easier to use options. So the idea of the concept of a headless browser is just, in a sense, you're pretending to be a person using a browser. Selenium runs Java runs a browser on a Java virtual machine, I think, and you basically control what it clicks. Some of the newer ones like PhantomJS and Nightmare, and these other ones which say for example Casper.js basically uses PhantomJS in the background, so there's a lot of overlap between these. And the Concept.js is developed by the same team as Codeception. So if you're used to using Codeception, you'll be quite comfy with Concept.js. And generally these things seem to get easier and easier. Like Phantom, I was using that 4 years ago, it's kind of a nightmare to use. And then I moved to Casper when that came out. It's much easier to write the scripts. And more recently we've moved to Codecept, because it's really, it's just yeah, so Casper.js is probably the easiest one to get started with. So you end up with it's all written in JavaScript, which please the JavaScript, right? Yeah, so you just write the script like this. This example just logs into Joomla and updates Joomla, which is an automation task in itself. So you can see you set the viewport this way. Would be the size of the browser window, and there's a bit of arbitrary. You can see you print echoes, and it's just if you're used to Node, it's a system you'd be comfortable in, and you can pass in parameters, domain username, password, and then it'll it'll log into the administrator part of that site, filling in the form for you with a username and password that you pass in. And it's really easy to capture screen grabs too. And yeah, you just control it using the DOM, like this sort of thing. So here we've got it looks at the footer of the admin section and it sees whether or not it's the current version, and if it's not the current version, it goes and it basically goes and clicks the purge button, and and then clicks the update button, and then it's much nicer to use the Joomla CLI now, because there's other things like here. Once it's clicked the button, you've got to wait an arbitrary amount of time before you go and do something else. But yeah, you can see the syntax is not particularly elegant in the sense there's, which is a good reason to briefly. The last thing we look at is look at concept.js. So this is like a business logic. What's that like? Design-driven test.
Jerky.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's
yeah. So basically, using concept, you can see the logic. You basically write what you're doing. It's kind of nice. So this script does exactly the same as the previous one, and you go to the administrator part and fill out fields. I fill field. It's very says what it does. I click login. You can see. It does the screen grabs as well, and then clicks. Yeah. Clicks. It clicks the install the update button here, and does a bunch of screenshots. But I mean, these both concept.js and Casper.js you can use really nicely in a Git. You could use in a GitHub post commit script, where even on a very basic level, you could have your execute a script which just goes to your site and takes a screen grab of the home page, and you could even have that so automate that so it diffs that screen grab of the home page with the one it took previously, and you can use that as a quick way to, and then slowly build out more and more tests for testing more and more features of your system. And the code section output, concept.js output is pretty much looks like this. You can see. And it doesn't really. You end up with like green ticks and red X's, and it tells you it passed. Yeah. So yeah, I think I was going to touch on monitoring a little bit and things. I'll skip over a bunch of things. Has anyone got any questions? I know we can do questions on
about the automatic fill-in with the passwords.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I start? Being a non-programmer SEO with no clue, because I thought it would be a very nice way to test whether forms are working in an automated way.
Yeah.
So what do I need to set that up?
So it's a really good example. I know I've got people who have the same, use the same sort of thing. Just test weekly that forms working.
Yeah.
Because obviously that's like if your call to action's failing, then so for probably the easiest starting point for that's probably with Casper.js.
Casper.js.
So you just if you're running on Linux, or what's the Microsoft? If you're running on Linux, you can just install it with like apt-get install Casper.js.
Okay.
That's fine. And the same with Brew. I don't use Brew, but I think Brew kind of works on OS X. And what's the? There's a new Microsoft one called. Is it called Chocolate? Or which I think, as I understand it, if you're using Windows, you can pretty much use the Brew command. The command you use in Brew in Chocolate. I think Chocolate is Microsoft's version of Brew, like package management system for open source. And so I have a tinker with that, and and the Casper.js website, it's all open source, but they've got lots of really good examples. Example scripts for like doing Google searches, for example, or that sort of thing, or logging into your Yahoo email. There's off the shelf, in the examples directory there's loads of stuff you can start with.
Nice, thank you.
I don't know whether it'd be good for querying Google search results and that sort of thing, in terms of.
Yeah, they make that very, very difficult. So if they see a lot of queries, they'll give you captchas. And,
Gotcha. But you could use it every day for grabbing whether you're the #1 in the search result, for example, based on the talk you did. So, and you could have it so it emailed you with a screen grab of the search results for your key terms.
Nice.
Any other questions? Or queries?
Yeah, so we were taking a lot of screenshots with the Casper.js and all.
Yeah.
So how do you compare images?
Yeah, see, I mean, it can work really nicely. For some, if your site's got static content, you can you could use that like for an automated, say, static content, or elements of your site where the content is more static. You could use something like that with a Git hook script, and you just have it so it outputs the screen grabs into a directory, and you could even version control your screen grabs with Git and use a Git status to see whether the image has changed from one view to the next. It's not going to work on if you've got like constantly changing content, like the images are always going to be different. But say for a contact form is a good example, because unless there's like changing side elements, like if you had like latest news on the site, it's gonna be different every time. But so you could use like use your version control tools to diff this week's test with last week's test, for example. That would be nice, and you could do that in a sense. You could have that so in practice it could be like unattended, unless there's a difference, and then you go. So it's really some of that sort of automation. It's not like that's what we tend to do a lot. It's not really proper automated testing, but it's more like using the testing automatically to flag whether or not then it needs human inspection, or but catch me afterwards anytime, or ask me on Twitter. There's a GitHub repositories, just Andy Gaskell, github.com/Andy Gaskell, and then I think that the repository at the top of the list is the one for this talk. It's got all the slides, and it's got examples in as well. Oh yeah. Yeah. So GitHub, Andy Gaskell, and this is the repository name, but ask me anything, anytime. And I'd like to say a big thanks to Ronan and the team. Oh, is this one? Yeah, cool. So I'd like to say a big thanks to Ronan and the team for everything, organising everything today, and that's it. Yeah. Oh, thanks. And breathe.